Building a real-time chat app was once a weeks-long development endeavor. However, thanks to Firebase and SwiftUI, building an app with authentication and real-time data becomes trivial, since the SDK takes care of state management and client data syncing for you. In fact, it becomes so easy, I'll show you how to build a real-time chat app in less than 35 minutes. If you're new to my channel, please make sure you like and subscribe. And without further ado, let's get started. So let's get started by creating a new Xcode project. You could call it anything you want. I'll call mine tutorial because I'm creative. For the interface, select SwiftUI. And then for the app lifecycle, also select SwiftUI App instead of UIKit App Delegate. You can go ahead and leave core data unchecked and click Next, then click Create. Awesome. So now that we've created our Xcode project, we can go ahead and configure our Firebase project. Alright, so before we get set up our Firebase project, we need to grab our bundle identifier, which is a unique string found in our project settings that identifies our app to Firebase. So copy that, and then we're going to open up the Firebase console, and then we're going to create a new project. Disable Google Analytics because we're not going to need it for this project. Then we create the project. Alright, so now that our project has been created, click on this iOS icon under the project overview to register our iOS app with Firebase. Paste in your bundle identifier and then click Register App. So now download the config file and then drag this into the root of your Xcode project. Alright, so now that we've added the Firebase config file to our project, we actually need to add the Firebase dependency. So we're going to go ahead and close out our Xcode project and open up terminal. We're going to cd into the Xcode project directory where you have your project stored. And then you're going to run pod init to create our pod file. So once your pod file has been created, you could go ahead and open it. And we're going to add two pods in here. We're going to add Firebase auth, and we'll add Firebase Firestore. These are the only two pods we're going to need for this tutorial. So go ahead and save it and then close it. And then we could run pod install to install the dependencies. Awesome. So now that we've installed our dependencies, we need to open the project using this XC workspace file generated by CocoaPods instead of using just the Xcode project file. So we can click that and it'll open up our project. Now we have Firebase installed in our app. So in our app file, which is just your project name followed by app.swift, we can go ahead and import Firebase. And inside of our app's initializer, we can just go ahead and run Firebase app.configure, which will automatically pull the data from our Google service info.plist file and load it into Firebase and connect with the Firebase server. Alright, so now that our project's all set up and we got Firebase configured, we can go ahead and start working on the authentication. So we're going to create a new folder, and I'm just going to call this util, and I'm just going to use this to keep all of the files that are responsible for fetching data and interacting with Firebase. So I'm going to create a new Swift file called sessionstore.swift. Alright, so in this file, let's import Firebase Authentication. And let's get started by creating our user model. So our user model is going to have two properties, both string types. The UID is simply the Firebase identifier for the user, and email is obviously the user's email. After we created our user model, we can get started creating our session store observable object. Our observable object is going to have two published properties. The session property is of type user and is going to just hold our user model if it's defined. It's of the optional type since it could be undefined. The other published property, is a boolean that will be true if the user is not logged in, and it will be false if the user is logged in. We will use this to change the user interface depending on the user's authentication state. Since both of these properties are published, it will automatically update the user interface whenever these values change. Alright, so now let's create a variable called handle to hold our authentication state listener. The reason why we're assigning this to a variable is so we could later on detach the listener when we're done with the view. And finally, I'm going to add a reference to the Firebase Authentication class. So now we're ready to define our first function, which is called listen. When we call listen, it will attach a listener to the authentication state, and Firebase will use this listener to send updates whenever it changes. So when we call the listen method on our session store, it will attach a listener to the Firebase authentication state. And basically, Firebase will use this listener to send any changes to the authentication state whenever it happens. So whenever the authentication state changes, Firebase executes this function, and it passes an auth and user. If user is defined, it means that the user is logged in. And we set isAnon to false because there is a user, so they're not anonymous. And we set the session equal to a user object that we fill in with the values from the user object from Firebase. Otherwise, if the user object is not there, which means they're not authenticated, we set isAnon to true, and we set the session to nil since there is no user. All right, so now that we finished that function, we're going to define functions that we can call to sign in the user, to sign up the user, and to sign out the user. All right, so our sign-in function is really simple. It has two parameters, email and password, both a type string. When we call the function with those two parameters, we call the sign-in method on authRef from up here with the email address and the password. It sends it to Firebase to authenticate. If it's successful, our authentication state listener up here will update the session and isAnon properties. Our sign up function is really similar to sign in, so we could just copy and paste it. And this is just create user with email. So, oops. And same deal. Cool. All right, so now we're going to write our sign out function. It's a little bit different than sign in and sign up since we actually have to handle an error. All right, so basically our sign out function returns a Boolean depending on whether the sign out was successful or not. So we could try to sign out, and if it's successful, it updates the session to make the user anonymous, and it returns true on this Boolean right here. Otherwise, it returns false. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and update isAnon appropriately too. So the user is anonymous if the sign out method succeeds. Otherwise, it just returns false on this. Finally, we're going to define one last method on our session store, and this is responsible for unmounting the authentication state listener. Basically, we call this whenever we unmount a view so we don't have the listener running in the background when the user is not on that page. All right, cool. So we finished our session store observable object. So now we actually need to build the user interface to use it. So we're going to create a screens folder, and I'm going to create two screens. So I'm going to be creating a new SwiftUI view, and I'm going to call this chat list. The chat list is going to be the main screen of the app, and it's going to display all the chat rooms a user can access. And then I'm going to create another screen. It's going to be called login. So our chat list screen is going to be the main screen of the app. The login screen is going to be presented as an overlay if the user is not authenticated, and it can't be dismissed unless the user signs in. So I'm going to go to content view, which if we look at our app view, we can see that content view is like the only thing here. I personally just like to do my changes on content view. So we're going to make the main screen of our app chat list. We could call like that. But we're going to add the login screen as a full screen cover. We're going to set the content of our full screen cover to login. So basically, a full screen cover is like a modal, except it can't be dismissed by a user. It covers the screen entirely. We're going to make it so it's only dismissible if the isAnon property right here is false. Right now we could see that the isPresented property is set to constant true, which means that it's just going to be always open. So let's go ahead and hook it up with our authentication. So in order to access our session store in our view, I'm going to create a new observed object, and we're going to set it to an instance of session store. So now that we have that, we could set isPresented equal to session store.isAnon. So now, when is_anon is false, this full screen cover will be dismissed and the user can use the app as normal. However, when is_anon is true, the user is not logged in, this will cover the app. It ensures the user is authenticated before they send messages. Now that we have that in place, we can go ahead and open our login view and do some work here. I'm going to wrap our login screen in a navigation view just so we could have the navigation bar title. So let's go ahead and set the navigation bar title to set the navigation bar to welcome. All right, so now let's build out the interface. We're going to use a VStack, a vertical stack, and we're just going to stack some text fields so the user can enter their email and password. And password. So now we can set the text property of our text field to be email, and let's add some styling onto it just so it looks a little nicer. And let's copy and paste that to we have a password field. And for passwords, we actually changed this to secure field. So now we need to create some buttons. And finally, we just hook these into our authentication. So basically, when we click these buttons, for the action, we want to call the sign in and the sign up method on our session store. So let's go ahead and add a new observed object and set it to an instance of session store. So now we're going to call sign in, and we're going to pass the email and the password. And we're going to do the same, except we're going to change it to sign up. All right. So now that we've created our user interface and we're already all hooked in with the authentication, let's go ahead and enable authentication on the Firebase console. So go to the authentication section and click on the sign in method tab. And we're going to enable the email and password provider. Click save. All right, so now that we've enabled authentication in the Firebase console, all we have to do now is call our authentication state listener, the listen method on Session Store. In the initializer of our content view, we can call listen, which should mount the authentication state listener onto our app. So now if we build it to my phone, we can see if it works. So this is our login screen, and we can test it out. So let's just put in a fake email, I guess. I don't think it matters. Sign up. All right, cool. So our authentication state listener is working. Our full screen cover is working. So we're all hooked up with authentication. So this is looking good. So now that we've set up authentication with our Xcode project, we're ready to get started fetching and storing data inside Firestore. To connect our Xcode application with Firestore, I'm going to create an object that will handle fetching and putting data into Firestore. So I'm going to create a new Swift file inside my util folder. And I'm going to call this file chatrooms view model. Inside the chatrooms view model, let's import Firebase. Before we create our view model, let's start by creating our chatroom model. So let's create a new struct and call it chatroom. And it's going to be a type codable and identifiable since we're going to be iterating over this object when we display it as a list. So our chatroom model has three properties. The ID property, which is of type string, is going to be the unique Firestore identifier for the chatroom object. The title is also a string, and this is just going to be the title field from the object. And the third property is called join code, and this is going to be a random number we generate that other users can use to join our chatroom. So actually, I'm going to go back to the Firebase console, and I'm going to add the join code field here. And it's going to be of type number. Click add. So now we could use that join code to join our sample chat room. So now that we've created our chat room model, we can go ahead and create our chat room view model, which is going to be of type observable object. It's going to have a published property called chat rooms, which will hold all of the chat room instances returned by Firebase. Then I'm going to create two references, one to the Firestore database class and another to the current authentication user. Now I'm going to create a method called fetchData. When we call this method, it will tell Firebase to start streaming data from Firestore to our application. Whenever the Firestore data changes, it will automatically send those changes to our application and update the chat rooms object. And since it's published, the user interface will automatically adapt to the changes. When we call fetchData, it will first check if the user is defined. If the user is defined, which means that the user is logged in, it will go ahead and query the chat rooms collection in our Firestore database for any documents where the users field contains the current user ID. The snapshot listener calls this function whenever we first call the fetchData method and whenever the data inside Firestore changes. So we're first going to check if any documents return. If there are documents returned, we can go ahead and map over those documents and turn them into chat room objects, which we can then fill our published chat rooms array with. So now that we've created our view model, we can go ahead and set up the user interface for displaying our chat room list. So if we go into our chat list screen, which we created earlier, let's get started by creating a list view. So if we go into our chat list screen, which we created earlier, I'm going to get started by creating a new observed object property called viewModel, and I'm going to set this to an instant of chat rooms viewModel. So now we could call fetchData on our viewModel inside of our chat list initializer. Which will attach the snapshot listener whenever this screen first appears. Inside of our view's body, we could change the placeholder text to be a navigation view. And inside the navigation view, let's go ahead and add a list to display our chat rooms. So now that we've created our list, we can now add a navigation bar title. And now we can build it to our phone and see what it looks like. Okay, so if we look on our phone, we can see that it loaded in our sample chat room from Firebase. So our view model is working and it's fetching data appropriately. And if we open the Firebase console and we change this to be like test chat room, we can see that the data instantly changes on our app and it automatically updates the user interface. So this is looking great. So right now, a user is able to see a list of all the chat rooms that they're a part of. However, they currently don't have a way of joining or creating a new chat room. So let's go ahead and implement that. To do so, we're going to add two new methods to our chat room view model. And these methods will be responsible for updating and putting new data into our Firestore database. So now let's create a new method called createChatRoom. It's going to accept a title, which is going to be a type string, and a handler, which is going to be a function that we can call after the chat room has been successfully stored in the Firestore database. So basically, our createChatRoom method is going to check if the user is defined. If the user is defined, we're going to add a document to our chat rooms collection in Firestore, and we're going to set the title to be the title we passed into our method. We're going to set the join code to be a random number between 10,000 and 99,000, and ideally, you would want to use something a little more robust to ensure there's no collisions, but for this tutorial, I'm just going to go with this. And finally, we're going to initialize the users array with the current user ID. We're going to check if there's an error, and if there is, we're just going to print it to the console. Otherwise, we're going to execute our handler we passed into our method. Now let's create another method called joinChatRoom. Our joinChatRoom method is going to accept a code of type string, and we're going to use this to look up a chat room to join in our Firestore database. And we're also going to pass in a handler, which again, we're going to call once or if the user successfully is added to a chat room. We're going to check if the user is defined, and if it is, we're going to query the chat rooms collection, and we're going to look for any documents where the join code is equal to the code passed into our method, and we're going to turn this into an int since we are storing it in Firebase as an int. We're going to get the documents, and if there's an error fetching those documents, we're just going to print that to the console. Otherwise, we're going to go through the documents returned by that query, and we're going to add the current user to the users field of the chat room. And then we're going to finally call the handler function passed into our method. So now that we set up our methods on our chat room's view model, we can go ahead and create the interface for joining a chat room. So I'm going to create a new screen. So let's create a new SwiftUI view. And we can just call this join. Let's wrap this in a navigation view. And let's add a title. Join or create, looks good. And let's go hook this up with the chat list view, which is where we're gonna summon this screen. So in our chat list screen, let's add a button to the navigation bar. And for our button, I'm actually going to use an icon. And to use SwiftUI icons, I just refer to the SF Symbols application you could download from Apple's developer website, and I just find something ideal. I think I'm going to use this plus circle, so let's grab its name, and we can use it in SwiftUI with the image, and we just pass it in like this. So now we're going to create a new state property, and when we press this button, we're going to set join modal to true. Let's add the join screen as a sheet to our navigation view. So we're going to set the content to be join, and we're going to set is presented to be join modal. So when join modal is true, this sheet will come up and cover the screen, and when join modal is false, it will be hidden. Cool. So now we could go to our join screen and get started laying out our interface. So I'm going to create a V-stack, a vertical stack, and I think I'm going to divide the page into two. So I'm going to create two other V-stacks. Let's add a title. Let's add a text field. And let's create some state properties to hold the value of our text fields. And we can set the text property of our text field to be join code. Finally, let's add a button, and let's copy and paste this. Change this to create. Enter your new title. And we're going to change this to be a new title. All right, so now that our interface is laid out, and I'm going to actually add some padding to this so they stay kind of apart from each other. So now we can add our chat room's view model as an observed object. And we're going to set that to an instance of chat room's view model. And we could call our methods that we added earlier. So when we press the join button, it will call viewModel.joinChatRoom. We're going to provide the join code state. We'll leave the handler blank for now. And let's do the same for the other button. Oh, and I just noticed there's a typo right here, so let's delete that. Let's set this to viewModel.createChatRoom, and we'll set that to new title. So for the handler on both the join and create buttons, we wanted to close this sheet once the action is successful. So the user successfully joined the chat room or the user successfully created the chat room. To do so, we're going to need to create a binding to the join modal state in the chat list. So to do so, we're going to actually create a new property on our join screen, and we're going to use the binding property wrapper, and it's going to be of type Boolean. And we could just now go to our chat list, and we can now pass is open, and we put join modal. And we go here, and we can set is open to be .constant true. Oh, true. So now in our completion handler, we can just simply do is open, do self.isOpen is equal to false. So now when the chat room is either successfully created or the user successfully joins a chat room, it will automatically close this sheet and it will allow the user to see the chat list with the new chat room on it. So now we can go ahead and test it out. So I actually put my sheet in the wrong place. So I'm going to put the sheet right below navigation bar items, and then I'm going to move all of these from being attached to the list, and I'm going to attach them to the H stack instead. So small mistake, but quick fix, and now we can see if the layout is fixed. Oh, that rhymed. There we go. So we can see that the layout doesn't have those weird borders anymore, and if we press the plus button, it shows our modal. The layout is not quite what I expected, but it should work. Let's go ahead and try to create a chat room. So we could call this new chat room. Create. And we can see that new chat room shows up in our list. And let's go ahead and go into the Firestore console and create a chat room that we're not a part of. So I'm going to remove the UID of the test user from the new chat room, and we're going to see if we could join it. So click delete field. And we saw that it instantly was removed from the list. And let's see if we could join it. So the join code is 37022. Join. And we can see it works. So now we're able to create and join chat rooms. So now that the user is able to see all of the conversations they're a part of, they're able to join chat rooms, and they're able to create new chat rooms, we're ready to create the message screen, which is going to display all of the messages that are a part of each individual chat room. So we're going to create a new view model. And I'm going to create a new Swift file, and we're going to call this messages view model. So let's just get started by importing Firebase, and let's create our message object, which is also going to be of type codable and identifiable, again, because we're iterating over this object when we display it in the list view. So it's going to have 3 properties. It's going to have the ID, which is going to be of type string. It's going to have the content, which will be the string content of each individual message. And finally, we're going to add the name property, which is going to be the name/email address that we're going to display next to each message. So now that we've created our message object, we can now create our messages view model. So I'm going to create a new class called messages view model, and it's going to be an observable object. I'm going to add a published property called messages, which will hold all of the message objects returned by Firebase. And then I'm going to create references to the current user and the Firestore class. So now I'm going to create a new method called fetchData, which will take in a document ID string. And we're going to use that document ID to reference the particular chat room from our Firestore database. We'll store all of the messages on a subcollection of the chat room called messages. So basically, when we call send message, it checks if the user is defined. And if it is, which means the user is authenticated, it adds a new document to the messages subcollection of the chat room documents. On each message, we add a sent at date, which we can use to order the chat room in chronological order. We have a display name, which I'm just setting to email, and we'll use this to display next to each method so we know who's sending what. We'll have the content field, which is, again, the message content string that we passed into this method. And finally, we have the sender, which is just the user ID of the current user. So now that we finished that method, we can now define our fetchData method, which will take in the string docID, and we could use this to query the database. Okay, so basically our fetchData method is similar to the fetchData methods we wrote on the other view model. So basically we check if the user is defined, and if it is, again, it means the user is authenticated. We query the messages subcollection on the chat room, which we use the document ID we passed in to find, and then we order those results by the sent at field, which is the date we sent up here, and we do it in descending order so the newest messages are at the bottom. So we add a snapshot listener, which again calls this function whenever there's updates on the data. And if there's no documents, it prints no documents and it just returns. Otherwise, it maps the return documents into message objects. And then finally, it sets our message property up here, or our messages property up here, to be the documents returned. And since it's published, it will automatically update our interface. So now that we finished our view model, we're ready to create the user interface. So let's go ahead and create a chat screen. So I'm going to create a new file, and then I'm going to create a new SwiftUI view. I'm going to call this messages. So now that we've created our messages screen, let's go ahead and hook up the navigation between the chat list view and the messages view. So on the chat list, we're going to wrap our H stack in a navigation link. So a navigation link will basically make our H stack tappable, and it makes it act like a button. And we can set the destination property to messages. So when we tap the H stack, it will now take us to our messages view. And we could go ahead and pass parameters from the chat list to our messages, which we're going to need to do since we need to know which particular chat room the user wants to see. So I'm going to go ahead and define a chat room property. It's going to be a type chat room. And now we can go ahead and pass the current chat room in as a parameter. And down here, to prevent any errors, we can go ahead and define a chat room to pass in here. So now that we defined our chat room property, we can go ahead and set the navigation bar title to be the chat room title. And we don't have to wrap this in a navigation view because navigation link pushes this view on the previous one, so it keeps this navigation view here. So if we defined a navigation view here, it would kind of put a navigation view within a navigation view, which is not what we want. So this navigation bar will replace this navigation bar title over here. So now we can add our view model as an observed object. And we can initialize it with an instance of messages view model. So now we can replace the text with a list view. And we could pass in view model dot messages. And we could pass the message content into a text object. So right now, the user can see all of the messages in the given chat room. However, they have no way of sending a message. So we're going to need to add a text field and a button at the bottom of the screen below the list where the user can enter their message and press send. So to do so, let's wrap our list in a V stack. And below the list, I'm going to add an H stack, a horizontal stack. So we can have a text field and a button next to each other. We'll have the button say send, and we'll have this text field say enter message. And let's create a state property to store that text field's value, and let's add some styling onto that text field. And for the button action, let's hook it up with the method we defined on viewModel. So let's call it viewModel dot send message. And for the message content, we could pass in the message field state. And for the doc ID, we could pass in chatroom dot ID. Cool. So if we now put this on our phone, actually, before we build it, we need to define our initializer. So let's create the init method, and we need to pass in a chat room and we need to set self.chatroom equal to chatroom, and then we need to call viewModel.fetchData, and let's pass in. Now let's build it to my phone. Okay, so now we can see that there's an arrow on each row, which means that this is tappable. So we tap the chat room. There's no messages in it right now, but we can send a message. So we can say, hello. And it just appears right there. But yeah, this works. If this video helped you, please like and subscribe for more tutorials and walkthroughs. I know we could have added a lot more features and made the UI look nicer, but this project is just supposed to be a starting point for any real-time SwiftUI apps you might want to build with Firebase. As always, the code's in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.